They turned me loose from Haverson on a gray morning in late March, handed me back the clothes I'd come in with, and $1 that didn't belong to anyone. And the guard at the last door looked at me like a man looks at a horse he's glad to be rid of. "Don't come back, Holloway," he said, and I told him I had no plans to, and that was the whole of our friendship after 7 years under the same roof. I want to tell it plain, the way an old man tells a thing when he's got nothing left to hide and no time left to dress it up. So I'll start where the cold started, on that road out of the territorial prison, with 200 miles of mud and melting snow between me, and a valley I had no right to expect would still want me. 7 years is a long time to think. I'd done little else. I'd gone in at 26 with a straight back and come out at 33 with a stoop I've never entirely lost, and in between I had built and torn down 1,000 versions of what I'd find at the end of that road. In most of them, Della Wren was married. That was only sense. A woman like that doesn't sit on a fence rail for 7 years waiting on a man the law called a thief. She'd have a husband by now, some steady fellow with clean hands, and children with her dark eyes, and she'd hear my name and feel nothing but a small old ache, the kind you'd feel for a coat you wore out and gave away. I told myself that was how it would be, and I told myself I could stand it. A man learns to stand a great deal in a stone room. I figured I'd go back only long enough to see my brother's grave and put my hand on the ground over him, and then I'd ride south and let Coldwater forget me the way you forget weather. I should tell you about Tom now, because everything I am and everything I did turns on him, and there's no understanding me without it. Tom was my younger brother by 4 years, and I'd half raised him after our mother went and our father followed her into the bottle, and then into the ground. Tom was quick where I was slow, bright where I was plodding, and he had a way of laughing that made hard men set down their grievances. He could charm a banker out of an extension and a girl out of a dance and a horse out of its meanness, and the only thing he couldn't charm was his own restlessness. It rode him the way a burr rides under a saddle blanket, working deeper the longer you leave it. By the spring I'm speaking of, Tom had a wife, a soft-voiced, iron-spined girl named Sari, and a baby coming, and a debt he'd dug himself into that I didn't know the bottom of until it was too late. He'd fallen in with a man named Pell who ran cattle that weren't his, moving them up through the high passes by night to a market that didn't ask questions. And Tom, who could not say no to easy money any more than he could say no to a dare, had let himself be drawn into it. I found out the night they got caught. He came pounding on my door near morning, white as a peeled stick, blood on his sleeve that wasn't his, and the story came out of him in pieces. A rancher's man had been shot in the dark, not killed, thank God, but shot, and the posse was forming, and Pell had run, and they had Tom's name and Tom's brand running and Tom's debt, and they'd hang the thing on him certain. He was 19 near enough. His wife was 7 months gone with their first. And he sat at my table and shook, and I looked at him, and I made the choice that took my next 7 years. I want to be honest about why I did it, because folks have made me out a saint over the years, and I'm no such thing. I didn't do it only for love of him, though I loved him. I did it because I could not stand the thought of Sari standing at a scaffold, and because some hard, cold part of me had already decided, somewhere in the back of my skull, that Tom would not survive a prison and I would. He was made of bright, thin glass. I was made of something duller and tougher. He'd shatter. I'd dent. So I told him to give me the coat with the blood on it, and I told him to take Sari and go far enough that no one would think to ask his name, and I told him I'd see to the rest. He argued. To his credit, he argued hard, and he cried, and he called me a fool, and I told him a man who lets his brother's child be born fatherless to save his own neck is the bigger fool, and that ended it. By the time the posse came up the road, I was sitting on my own porch with that coat, and a story that fit me better than it ever fit him, because I was the older brother, the quiet one, the one who'd always handled the money. Easy to believe I was the mind behind it, and Tom only the boy I'd dragged along. They believed me. I made sure they believed me. And the only person in that whole valley who never believed a word of it was Della Wren. I'd been courting Della going on 2 years by then. Courting is too small a word. I'd been hers from the first county dance, where she looked at me across the lantern light like she could see the dull, tough thing I was made of, and had decided she had a use for it. Her father had a horse ranch up the Burnt Fork, the best high country breeding string in 3 counties, and Della ran more of it than he did even then, before his hands went bad. She could gentle a colt that had thrown 3 grown men, and she could add a column of figures faster than the feed merchant, and she had a temper she kept on a short rope, but you always knew was there, the way you know a river is there under the ice. I'd meant to marry her that summer. I had the words half said and the ring half saved for, and instead I sat in a courtroom and watched her face go from disbelief to fury to something worse than either, a kind of stricken understanding, as I stood up and admitted to a thing I hadn't done, in a voice steady enough to damn me. She found me in the jail before they took me to Haverson. They let her in because old Sheriff Brew had a soft spot for her and a bad conscience about the whole business. She stood on the other side of the bars in her riding clothes with her hair coming down, and she didn't waste breath on tears. "You didn't do it," she said. I told her I had. "You're a poor liar, Asa Holloway, you always were. You can fool a courtroom full of men who want it tidy. You can't fool me." She gripped the bars. "Tell me the truth and I'll fight it. I'll get a lawyer down from the Capitol. I'll sell the geldings, I'll mortgage the place, Della." I put my hand over hers on the iron and I felt her shaking under the steadiness she was holding so hard. "Don't. Whatever you think you know, you put it down and you leave it down and you don't ever pick it up again. There's a child coming who needs his name clean more than I need mine. Can you understand that?" And she did understand it. That was the cruelty of it. She was too smart not to. I watched the whole shape of it land on her, that I was choosing this, that I would not be talked out of it, that there was a baby somewhere who'd be a bastard orphan in the world's eyes if I opened my mouth. She understood, and she hated that she understood, and her face when she finally pulled her hand back from mine is a thing I carried into the dark of that prison and held onto on the worst nights, because even broken, it was the truest thing anyone ever turned toward me. 7 years, she said, the judge had said it that morning. "I'll be at the gate, Asa, the gate where you kissed me, the one your father hung crooked and you never straightened." She tried to make it light and it came out like a vow off an altar. "I'll be standing right there." "Don't," I said again. "Marry someone, have your life. I won't have you wasted on the fence." She looked at me a long moment. "You don't get to tell me what to do with my own life, Asa Holloway," she said. "You never did. You're not starting now from in there." And she turned and walked out of that jail with her back straight, and I didn't see her again for 7 years. I won't dwell on the years inside. There's no use in it, and it isn't what this story is for. I'll tell you only that I learned how to be still without going to pieces, that I learned the names of the men I'd otherwise have feared, and learned that most of them were as wrecked and homesick as I was, and that I got a letter from Tom maybe twice a year, careful letters with no names and no places in them, telling me the baby had come and was a girl, telling me they were getting on, telling me he'd make it right someday, and I'd write back and tell him there was nothing to make right, and to keep his head down and his mouth shut and raise that child. And then in my 5th year, the letters stopped. I didn't know why for a long while. I told myself the mail had lost them, or Tom had moved past where a letter could find him, or, and this was the fear I lived with, something had gone wrong and I'd never know. A man in a cell can do nothing with a fear like that but carry it. I carried it. Della never wrote. I told her not to, and she was a woman who'd take you at your word when she meant to punish you with it. But twice a year, regular as the seasons, a parcel came to the prison addressed to me in a hand I didn't know, with no letter inside, only socks, thick wool socks knitted close, the kind you make for a man who stands on stone all day, and once a winter coat, and once a packet of whorehound candy that I made last 4 months. There was never a name. The guards thought it was a churchwomen's charity. I knew those socks. I'd seen her knit 100 pairs by the fire on the burnt fork, her needles going while she scolded me about something. She wasn't writing. She was just letting me know, in the only language she'd allow herself, that I hadn't fallen all the way out of the world. So you'll see why, riding home on that gray March morning, I let myself hope a little and then beat the hope down with a stick. The socks could mean she'd waited. They could just as easily mean she was a kind woman who'd married well and could afford the wool and the pity. 7 years. A girl of 24 when I went in was a woman of 31 now. I'd be a stranger with a stoop and prison in my eyes. I told myself I'd see the gate and ride past it. It took me 11 days to reach the valley, working for meals where I could, sleeping cold most nights, and the closer I got the more the country gave me back. The smell of it, first pine pitch and snowmelt and wood smoke, the high thin air that makes a flatlander's chest ache. Then the shapes of the mountains, the same gray teeth against the sky I'd looked at every day of my life until I'd looked at a stone wall instead. I came down the last grade into the burnt fork valley on the 12th morning, and there was cold water laid out below me, smaller than I remembered, the way everything from before is smaller than you remember, and the holloway place beyond it up the fork, and I had to stop the horse and sit a minute because my hands weren't steady. I went into town first. That was my mistake, but I had to know about Tom, and the only way to know was to go to the churchyard, and the churchyard was in town. Coldwater had not forgotten me. I'd hoped 7 years might have worn me thin in their memories, but a town like that keeps its grudges polished. I felt them before I saw them. The way the man outside the mercantile stopped sweeping when I rode past, the way 2 women crossing the street saw my face and gathered their skirts and their children and steered wide. I heard my name move down the boardwalk ahead of me faster than my horse could walk. By the time I'd tied up at the churchyard fence, half of Coldwater knew the thief was back. I'll tell you what I found in that churchyard, because it's the second thing this story turns on, and it knocked the wind clean out of me. I found Tom. A small stone, well kept, the grass cut close around it. He'd been dead 2 years, which answered all at once and too late why the letters had stopped. Fever, I learned later, the kind that comes through a valley and takes the young as easy as the old. He'd died 2 years gone, and I'd been sitting in a cell building him a future in my head the whole time. And next to him, smaller, was another stone, and it was Ceres, dead within the same season. The fever had taken them both and left. I stood there with my hat in my hands and the cold coming up through my boots, and I did the arithmetic that no man should have to do over his brother's grave. They were both gone, which meant the child, the girl, Tom's girl, the one whose clean name I'd traded 7 years of my life for, was somewhere in this valley, an orphan, 5 or 6 years old by now, and she belonged to no one but me. I don't remember kneeling, but I was kneeling. I put my hand flat on the cold ground over my brother the way I'd promised myself I would, and I said the only thing I had to say, which was, I kept my word. I kept it the whole way. I'm sorry it bought you so little. And then I heard a step behind me on the frozen grass, and I knew it. 7 years and a stone wall, and I knew that step the way you know your own heartbeat. I turned around, and Della Wren was standing in the churchyard gate. She was 31, and she was not a girl anymore, and she was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen or ever would. There was gray coming at her temples at 31, put there by something, and I knew by what, and her face had gone from the soft of a girl's to the carved of a woman who's done hard work in hard weather and meant it. She had on a man's coat and her father's old hat, and there was mud to her knees because she'd been working when word reached her, and she dropped whatever she was doing and come, and she stood in that gate with her chest heaving from the run and looked at me across the rows of the dead. Neither of us said anything for a long time. There wasn't anything that would carry across that distance. Finally, she came forward, picking her way between the stones, and she stopped an arm's length off, and she looked at me, at the stoop, at the gray in my own hair, at the prison that I knew was sitting in my eyes, and her jaw was working the way it did when she was holding the river under the ice. "You're late," she said. That was all. You're late. 7 years, and that was all she had, and it was everything, because the only way a person can be late is if you've been waiting on them. Della, my voice came out wrecked. I told you not to. I know what you told me. She took a breath that shook. I've had 7 years to think about what you told me, Asa Holloway, and I'll tell you what I decided. I decided you don't get to throw your life into a hole for your brother's sake and then tell me what to do with mine into the bargain. I decided I'd do what I pleased, and it pleased me to wait. Her voice cracked clean across. It pleased me to be furious at you every single day and to wait anyway. So you can take your I told you not to, and you can. And then she ran out of words, which I had never once in my life seen happen, and she crossed the last of the distance, and she hit me in the chest with the flat of her hand, hard, once. And then she had two fists in my coat and her face against my collar, and she was not crying so much as shaking the way the ice shakes the year it breaks up, all at once, with a sound like something tearing loose. I held her. I'd forgotten, you forget, in a place like Haverson, you forget on purpose because remembering will kill you. I'd forgotten what it is to hold a living person who wants holding. I stood in that churchyard with my dead on one side of me and my living in my arms, and I didn't trust myself to say a word. When she could, she pulled back and scrubbed her face with the heel of her hand, furious at her own tears, and she looked past me at the two graves and her face changed. You didn't know, she said, about Tom, about Sari. It wasn't a question. I knew the letters stopped. I thought I couldn't finish it. The fever came through 3 winters back, took near 40 in this valley. She was quiet a moment, respectful of the ground. They'd settled over near 2 rivers where nobody knew them, lived quiet. Tom worked for a freight line. He was he was good. Whatever he was before, that girl made him good and the baby finished the job. He'd send word to me, careful word, never to you because he wasn't sure the prison wouldn't read it and put things together. He wanted to come clear it all someday. He told me so. She looked at me hard. I want you to hear that. He never stopped meaning to set it right. The fever just got there first. I had to look away from her then because there's a kind of grief that's too private even for the person you love most. And that was the kind I had standing over my brother's stone, knowing he died still owing me a thing neither of us could ever now repay or release. The child, I said when I could. There was a child, a girl. And Della went still, and then something came into her face that I can only call ferocious, a thing I'd see again before the year was out, and she said, yes, there's a girl. Her name is Pen. She's 6 years old and she has your brother's exact laugh, and she is up at the Burnt Fork right now, where she has lived for 2 years, because when the county was about to send her off to a foundling home 300 miles from everyone she'd ever known, I went down to the courthouse and I told them I'd take her, and I've raised her since, and I will fight any man, woman, judge, or jury that tries to say I haven't the right. She lifted her chin. So now you know. You came home to a grave and an orphan and a town that wants to hang you twice. Welcome back, Asa. I'll never, as long as I live, get over what that woman did with the 7 years I gave her. I had pictured her married. I had pictured her wasted, sour, broken on the fence I'd told her not to sit on. What she'd actually done was keep my family alive single-handed while I sat in the dark feeling sorry for myself. She'd waited and worked and raised my dead brother's daughter and held the whole sorry wreck of the Holloways together with her own 2 hands, and she'd done it furious, and she'd done it anyway, and she'd knitted me socks the entire time. We rode up the Burnt Fork together that afternoon, and the first thing I saw when we came over the last rise was the gate. The crooked gate, the one my father hung wrong 40 years gone and I never straightened, the one where I'd kissed her the first time and the last time where she'd sworn she'd stand. It wasn't crooked anymore. Somewhere in those 7 years she'd taken it off its hinges and hung it true, and there was a child sitting on the top rail of it in a too big coat, swinging her legs, watching the road. And when she saw Della, she lit up like a lamp and waved both arms. And then she saw me beside her and went still and wary the way children do. Pen, Della called, swinging down. Come here, there's somebody you've been hearing about. The girl came, careful, and stood close to Della's leg and looked up at me, and Della put a hand on her dark head and said, simple as anything, "This is your Uncle Asa. This is the one in the photograph. The one we set the place for at Christmas." I didn't know they'd set a place for me at Christmas. I learned that day there was a great deal I didn't know about how loved a man can be while he's busy believing himself forgotten. I got down off the horse slow, because I'd learned that quick movements scare the ones who have had hard lives, and I crouched in the mud of my own road in front of my brother's daughter, and she looked at me out of Tom's exact eyes, and after a minute she said, in a small, clear voice, "You went away to keep my daddy safe." I looked up at Della, and Della looked back at me steady, and I understood that she'd told this child the truth, the real truth, the one I'd ruined my life to bury. But she'd told it as a thing to be proud of instead of a thing to be ashamed of, and somehow in her telling it had become the second thing this whole bitter business had purchased after the years. A little girl who looked at me not as a thief, but as a man who'd done the hardest thing there is, which is to take another person's weight and carry it in silence. "I did," I said. My voice didn't hold up well. "I went away to keep your daddy safe." "Then why are you sad?" Penn asked. "Because I came back too late to tell him it worked," I said, before I could think better of saying a true thing that hard to a child. But she only nodded, very serious, as if that made perfect sense, and then she took my big rough hand in her two small ones and said, "We have a place for you at the table," and led me through the straightened gate into the only home I'd ever really had, and that was the beginning of the rest of my life. It wasn't easy after that, and I'd be lying to make it sound so. A man doesn't come out of 7 years in a stone box and slide soft into a happy ending. The first weeks were the hardest. I slept poorly and woke worse, reaching for walls that weren't there, and more than once Della found me out in the cold before dawn just standing, looking at the sky, learning over again that it didn't stop. She never made a fuss of it. She'd come out with 2 cups of coffee and stand beside me and not say anything, and her shoulder against my arm did more than any words could have. The work saved me, the way work will. The burnt fork string had thinned in the lean years. Della had sold off geldings to pay the taxes and keep the bank off. She told me plain, no shame in it, just arithmetic, but the bloodline was sound, and there's no medicine for a wrecked man like a green colt that needs him. I started with the rough stock nobody wanted, because that was company I understood, and I found that my hands remembered what my head had nearly forgotten. By the time the snow gave way to the first real green of that spring, I had 4 broke and saddle gentle that we'd thought we might have to put down, and Della watched me work the last of them in the round pen one evening, leaning on the rail with Pen on her hip, and she said, "There you are." "Here I am," I said. "No," she said. "I mean there you are. I've been wondering where you went. 7 years I've been wondering, and there you are." I want to tell about Pen, because that child rebuilt me as much as the horses did. She was 6 and then she was 7, all that first year, and she followed me like a burr. And she asked the kind of questions only a child has the nerve for. What was prison like? Did I ever get scared? Did I miss my mama? Why did the men in town say bad words about me? I answered her honest where I could and gentle where I couldn't. And somewhere in there, she stopped being my brother's ghost looking out at me through familiar eyes and became her own self entirely. A fierce, funny, stubborn little person who could already sit a horse better than children twice her age, and who'd taken Della's habit of getting furious at the people she loved most. She'd lost more before age 6 than most folks lose in a lifetime, and instead of going small and frightened she'd gone wide open, the way Tom had been before the burr got under his blanket, and I made a quiet vow over her sleeping head one night that whatever it cost me, that openness was not going to get punished out of her the way the world had tried to punish it out of her father. I'd already paid 7 years to keep her name clean. I'd pay whatever else came. What came was Garrett Halloran. I should have known there'd be a Halloran. There's always a man with money and patience who spent the lean years circling something he means to have. Halloran ran the biggest spread in the valley, the Crooked H, a low country operation that had been buying up the high meadows piece by piece as the small ranchers failed, and somewhere in my absence he'd set his eye on two things: the burnt fork water rights, which fed half his lower range in a dry year, and Della Wren. I found out the shape of it slow, the way you find out hard things in a small valley, in pieces dropped by people who assume you already know. Halloran had been courting Della, courting is again too small a word, pressing her, leaning on her, the way a big man leans on a fence to see will it give for the better part of 3 years. He'd offered marriage. He'd offered to buy the burnt fork outright at a price that, in those lean years, would have been a mercy and an escape. And Della had said no to both, every time, and Halloran was not a man who took a no he didn't believe in as final. I learned all this and I sat on it a while because a man fresh out of prison has to be careful about the unjares he picks up. They can run away with him. But then I learned the last piece, the piece Della hadn't told me, and that one I couldn't sit on. The bank in Coldwater held a note on the burnt fork. Old man Wren had borrowed against the place in the hard year before he died, to keep the breeding string together, and Della had been carrying that note on her back the whole 7 years, paying it down a colt at a time, and the note was held by the Coldwater Cattlemen's Bank, and the Coldwater Cattlemen's Bank was 3/4 owned by Garrett Halloran. He'd been carrying her note like a man carries a long rope, paying it out slow, waiting. As long as she had no husband and no help, the day would come when one bad winter or one sick season would put her behind. And on that day, Garrett Halloran would be standing there with the rope, all kindness, offering marriage or offering to take the place off her hands. And either way, he'd have his water and he'd have his win. And then I'd come home. A man, a thief, the valley thought, but a man and a working one, and one the woman plainly wanted. I'd come home and started breaking horses that could be sold, and suddenly that note might get paid down faster than Halloran liked, and suddenly the long patient rope was going slack in his hands. He came up to the burnt fork on a fine June morning to take its measure. I'll give him this, he came himself, didn't send a man, and he sat his expensive horse easy and tipped his hat to Della like a gentleman and called her Miss Wren in a voice with real warmth in it, because the worst part about Halloran, the part that made him dangerous, was that he wasn't a villain in his own mind. He thought he loved her. He thought taking the burnt fork was a kindness he was doing her. Men like that are harder than the plain crooks because you can't shame them. They've already explained themselves to themselves. He looked at me for a long moment. I was standing at the round pen with a lead rope in my hand and 7 years on my face. "Holloway," he said, "I heard you were back." He didn't say it unkind. He said it the way you'd note the weather. "I knew your brother a little and your father." A pause that did a lot of work. "Hard family for trouble." "We've had our share," I said. I kept my voice level. I'd learned to keep my voice level in a school that had no mercy for men who couldn't. "Miss Wren's had a hard road of it," Halloran went on, turning back to her, gentling his voice. "Carrying this place alone, raising the child. A woman oughtn't have to carry so much." He let that hang. "There's no shame in letting a thing go, Della, when it's grown too heavy. I've said it before and I'll say it kind, my offer stands. Either offer." And Della, who'd been quiet, leaning on the rail with that river running under her ice, said in a perfectly pleasant voice, "Mr. Halloran, I've carried this place 7 years and the only thing about it grown too heavy is the note your bank holds, and I'll have that paid by the new year so you can quit losing sleep on my account." She smiled at him, and it was a smile with teeth in it. Was there anything else? I watched something pass over Halloran's face, surprise, and then a kind of recalculation, the look of a man who'd had a sum come out wrong. He'd thought the note would take her years yet. He looked at me again, at my hands, at the green-broke colt behind me, and he understood, the way I'd understood about the rope, that a working man on this place changed his arithmetic. "By the new year," he said, mild. "Well, we'll see what the winter brings." And he touched his hat and rode off down the fork, and Della and I stood and watched him go, and she said, not looking at me, "He'll do something. He always does when a thing doesn't come to him easy. It won't be a thing you can hit either. It'll be paper or weather or a word in the right ear. That's how Hallorans fight. By the new year, I said, can we make it, Della, honest? She was quiet a moment. Honest? It'll be the closest thing you ever saw. If the colts sell and the winter's kind and nothing breaks, we make it by a hair. If anything goes wrong, she didn't finish. Then we'll see it doesn't go wrong, I said, and she looked at me. And there was something in her face I'd been waiting for without knowing it. Not the fierce thing and not the furious thing, but a softer thing, a leaning toward. The first real one since the churchyard. We, she said, trying the word. We, I said, if you'll have a thief for a partner. I never once thought you were a thief, Asa Holloway. She said it quiet and flat, a thing long settled. I'm the only person in this whole valley who's known the truth of you for 7 years, and I'll tell you something I decided about that too. She turned to face me full on. I decided I'm done being the only one. I decided that someday, before I'm in the ground, this valley is going to know what you did and why, and they're going to be ashamed of every word they've spat at you, and you're not going to talk me out of that the way you talked me out of fighting it before. Della, the old cold fear came up in me. There's Penn, if it comes out what Tom did. Tom's dead, Asa. She said it gentle, but it was iron underneath. Tom is past being hurt by the truth. And Penn, her voice changed, fierce again. Penn is going to grow up in a valley that knows her father was a boy who made a bad mistake and her uncle was a man who loved him enough to pay for it. That's not a shame. That's the proudest thing I ever heard, and I have told her so every day of her life. And I am done, do you hear me? I am done letting you carry it like it's filth. It's not filth. It's the finest thing you ever did and the worst thing that ever happened to you, both at once. And I'm not going to let this valley go on calling the finest thing you ever did a crime. I didn't have an answer for that. I'd built 7 years and the whole architecture of my soul on the idea that the truth had to stay buried, that the silence was the gift, that to speak it would be to undo the only worthwhile thing I'd done. And here was this woman telling me she'd spent the same 7 years deciding the exact opposite. And the terrible thing was that I could feel, standing there in the June grass, that she might be right and I might have been wrong. And a man does not easily look at 7 years and wonder if he aimed them slightly off true. I said the only thing I could. I'm afraid of it, Della. I'll tell you plain because I've stopped having the strength to lie to you. I'm afraid of what comes loose if I open my mouth. And she crossed the distance between us, the way she had in the churchyard, but slow this time, and she put her hand flat on my chest where she'd struck me before, and she said, I know you are. That's why I'll be standing right beside you when you do it. I've been at that gate 7 years, Asa. I'm not moving now. We married in September. There wasn't much to it by design. We'd both had our fill of being looked at by Coldwater. The circuit preacher came up the fork on his rounds and married us in the dooryard of the Burnt Fork with the colts looking on over the corral rails and Penn holding the ring she'd insisted on carrying, and an old neighbor woman named Mrs. Tays, who'd never once crossed the street to avoid me, standing witness. Della wore her mother's dress, taken in, and I wore the one good coat I owned. And when the preacher got to the part about better or worse, Della laughed out loud, a real laugh, the first I'd heard from her since I came home, and said we'd done the worse already and meant to enjoy the rest, and even the preacher smiled. That night, with Penn asleep in the fire down to coals, I sat with my wife on the porch of the home I'd never thought to have, and I told her the thing I'd been carrying. I keep waiting, I said, for it to be taken back. 7 years I waited for the worst to come, and it kept coming, and now there's this, and I don't know how to hold a good thing, Della. I've gone out of practice. You hold it the way you held the bad thing, she said. One day at a time, and you don't put it down, you just point yourself the other direction. She leaned her head on my shoulder. I'll show you. I've gotten good at it. I had to. The winter, when it came, was not kind. It came early and it came mean. The worst the valley had seen in a generation. The first storm hit in the second week of November, and the snow didn't let up for 3 days. And when it finally broke, we'd lost fence and we'd lost 2 colts that got into a drift and went down. And the pass to the lower country, where the buyers were, where the colts had to go to make the note closed solid. I have to tell this part careful, because it's where everything I am got tested, and where the woman I married showed the whole valley what she was made of. The note came due the first of the year. We had the colts to make it 8 head, green broke and gentle, worth good money to the right buyer down in the flatland market. But the pass was shut, and a shut pass in that country can stay shut till April, and the bank, Halloran's bank, did not extend notes on account of weather. Della had said it back in June. It won't be a thing you can hit. It'll be paper or weather. The weather had come, and behind the weather patient was the paper. And behind the paper was Garrett Halloran, who had only to wait now, the way he'd waited all along, and let the snow do his work. A man came up from the bank the week before Christmas, half froze and apologetic, to remind us of the date and to mention, kindly, oh so kindly, that Mr. Halloran remained willing to take the place off our hands at a fair figure, snow or no snow, and save us the trouble. The implication sat in the warm kitchen with us after the man had gone. Pay by the first or lose it, and you can't pay by the first because we both know the pass is shut, so be reasonable and sell to Halloran before you lose it for nothing. I sat at the table that night after Penn was abed, and I looked at the impossible arithmetic of it, and the old despair came up in me, the stone room despair, and I said, maybe we sell to him, Della, get out from under clean, keep some money, start somewhere the valley doesn't. No, she didn't even let me finish. She was standing at the window with her arms crossed, looking out at the dark and the snow, and she had the fierce thing on her, the thing I'd seen in the churchyard when she spoke of Penn. No, he's been waiting 7 years for me to be reasonable. I'll be a great many things before I'm dead, a Sal Holloway, but reasonable for Garrett Halloran on his timetable with his rope around my neck, no. There's another way over the mountain than the pass. I've known it since I was a girl. My father used to take the high string over the Devil's Stair in a hard year when the pass shut. I knew the Devil's Stair by reputation. Every man in the valley did. It was a goat track over the shoulder of the high peak, 3,000 feet up and exposed the whole way, that cut 20 miles off the pass road and would, in winter, kill you about as soon as look at you. Men had died on the Devil's Stair in good weather. Della, in this snow, with 8 head of green colts, that's the only road there is, she said. So it's the road we take. I've been over it twice. I know the turns. You take green colts over it slow, on lead in the cold dawn when the snow's hard, and you do not stop and you do not look down, and you get to the flatland in 2 days instead of waiting for April. She turned from the window. And we make the note. And Garrett Halloran sits in his big house and watches his rope go slack in his hands, and there is not one single thing he can do about it, because the note doesn't say how the money gets to the bank. It just says it's there by the first. I looked at my wife standing in the lamplight, 31 years old, gray at the temples, fierce as a cornered cat, proposing to take 8 horses over a killing mountain in the dead of the worst winter in a generation rather than bend her neck 1 inch to a patient, cruel man. And I understood, finally and all the way down, that I had not come home to a woman who'd been waiting to be rescued. I'd come home to the strongest person I had ever known, who had been doing the rescuing of my land, of my family, of my brother's child, of my very name, for 7 years while I sat in the dark, and who was not about to stop now just because her husband had finally turned up. All right, I said, we go over the stair, but I lead and you follow, and if it gets bad. You lead the first half and I lead the second, she said, because you don't know the turns past the saddle and I do, and that's not pride talking, that's the truth talking, and you married a woman who tells you the truth, so you'll do well to listen to her. And she was right. And I knew she was right, and I shut my mouth and we went over the Devil's Stair. I'll not stretch out the crossing into more than it was. It was 2 days of the hardest, coldest, most frightening work of my life, and I'd been in a place that specialized in hard and cold and frightening. We left before light with the 8 colts on a lead string and pen, because there was no one to leave her with and no question of leaving her, bundled to the eyes and riding double behind Della on the steadiest of the saddle horses. We went up through the timber in the blue dark, and out above it where the wind had a clean run at us, and onto the stair itself, where the track was a foot of hardpack with a wall of stone on one hand and 1,000 feet of nothing on the other, and we went one slow step at a time, Della calling the turns back to me where the way wasn't plain, her voice steady the whole time, steady for the colts and steady for the child and steady, I think, for me. There was a place near the top, a switchback the locals called the pulpit, where the track narrowed to almost nothing and a colt near the back of the string spooked at a falling sheet of snow and went sideways, scrabbling, its hindquarters out over the drop. And for one long, horrible second, I thought we'd lose it and maybe the two behind it and maybe more. And it was Della off her horse in an instant, throwing the lead of her own mount to me, and going down that foot of icy track on her own 2 feet faster than was safe, who got to that colt's head and got a hand on its halter and talked to it, low and steady, the way only she could, the way she'd talked to 100 mean colts on the burnt fork, and walked it backward off the edge inch by inch onto solid track, while the whole string trembled and Penn sat frozen and silent and brave on the horse behind. And I held my breath and 4 lead ropes and prayed. She got it back. Of course she got it back. I don't think there was ever a moment watching her that I truly believed she wouldn't, and that belief was the thing 7 years in a stone box had nearly killed in me, and that this woman in 2 days on a killing mountain gave back. When she climbed back up to her horse, her face was gray with cold and her hands were shaking, and she looked at me and said, "Don't you say a word about it being too dangerous." And I said, I wasn't going to. I was going to say I never saw anything braver in my life. And she looked at me a second and then she laughed, that real laugh, up there on the roof of the world with death on one side of us, and we went on. We came down off the stair into the flatland on the evening of the 2nd day, all of us alive, all 8 colts alive, and we sold the string the next morning to a buyer who took one look at the gentle on them and paid top dollar. And we rode into Coldwater on the 30th of December, and we walked into the Coldwater Cattlemen's Bank, and we paid the note in full, in front of the clerk and the manager and 2 ranchers who happened to be standing there. And word of it was over the whole valley by nightfall. The Holloways had gone over the Devil's Stair in the worst winter in living memory rather than sell to Garrett Halloran, and they'd made it, and they'd paid, and the rope had gone slack for good. That should be the end of it. It nearly is. But there's one thing more, the thing Della had sworn to in the June grass, and she was not a woman who forgot a vow. The valley's regard for us shifted after the stair. You can hate a man for being a thief, but it's hard to go on hating a man you've watched do something that takes that kind of nerve and heart, and the story of the crossing did something the 7 years of silence never could. It made Coldwater look at me again and look harder and start, here and there, to wonder. I'd feel it in town, a nod where there'd been a cold shoulder, a word from a man who used to cross the street. The wondering had started. And Della meant to finish it. There's a thing they did in Coldwater every year on the first Sunday after the New Year, a gathering at the church, half service and half town meeting, where the whole valley turned out to mark the year past and the year coming. It was the one day everyone was in one room, and on that first Sunday of the New Year, with the note paid and the stair behind us and the whole valley packed into the little church, Della Wren Holloway stood up. I didn't know she was going to. She hadn't told me because she knew I'd have tried to stop her, and she'd promised me she'd be standing beside me when it came, and she'd kept the promise in her own way. She'd waited until we were standing, the 3 of us, in a pew at the back, and then she stood up where everyone could see her, and she waited for the room to go quiet, which it did, because when Della Wren stood up in a room, people had learned to listen. "I've got something to say," she said, "and I've waited 7 years to say it, and you're all going to sit and hear it, because most of you have spent those 7 years saying things about my husband, and now it's my turn." You could have heard the snow fall. I reached for her arm to stop her, and she took my hand instead and held it hard and didn't sit. And she told them, All of it. She told them about the night Tom came pounding on the door and the choice I made, and why about Sari 7 months gone, about a baby that would have been born to a hanged father, about a man who looked at all that and decided his own life was the smaller price. She told it plain, and she told it without sparing me my fear, and she looked around that church at the people who'd spat my name, and she said, "You've called him a thief for 7 years. He let you. He let you because the truth had a child's name attached to it and he wouldn't risk her for his own good name. That's the man you've been crossing the street to avoid. That's the criminal you wouldn't sell flour to without making a face." Her voice didn't shake. The river had come out from under the ice and it was running clean and cold and unstoppable. Her name is Penn. She's 7 years old and she's sitting right back there. And her father was a boy who did a foolish thing and grew into a good man before the fever took him. And her uncle gave up 7 years of his life, and the woman he was going to marry and his whole good name, so that she could grow up belonging to somebody instead of being a thief's bastard in your eyes. And I have stood beside him at a crooked gate and over a killing mountain, and I will tell you for the last time, and you will believe me because you know me and you know I do not lie. There is no finer man in this valley, and there never was, and you owe him better than you've given. Every single one of you, and I expect to see you start paying it back on your way out the door." And she sat down. For a moment nobody moved. Then old Mrs. Tays, who'd stood witness at our wedding, stood up in the front and turned around and looked at the whole church and said in her cracked old voice, "Well, I've known it 3 years and held my tongue because she asked me to. She's done now, and so am I," and she came down the aisle to the back where we stood, and she took my hand in both of hers and she said, "Welcome home, Asa Holloway. It's about time somebody said it proper." And then there was another, and the dam that Della had broken open kept on breaking, and I stood at the back of that church with my wife's hand crushing mine and my brother's daughter pressed against my leg, and I let the whole valley come to me, one ashamed and decent person at a time, and I did not try to talk a single one of them out of it. Garrett Halloran was in that church. I'll give him this last thing: he didn't slink out. He waited till near the end, and he came down the aisle last of all, and he stood in front of me, and he looked at Della a long moment with something in his face that might have been the closest thing to grace he had in him, and then he put out his hand to me and said, "I misjudged you, Holloway. The whole valley did. I'll not be the only man too proud to say so." And I shook his hand, because Della was watching and because a man who's been given as much mercy as I had that morning has no right to withhold it. And Halloran nodded once and put on his hat and went out into the snow, and he never pressed Della or the burnt fork again. He sold the Crooked H 3 years later and went east. I don't know what became of him. I've thought of him kindly more than once, which surprises me still. Now I'm an old man, and I'm telling this on the porch of the Burnt Fork, where I've sat most evenings for more years than I was ever alive before I came home. The gate's still straight. I've kept it so. Della's been gone 2 winters now. She went the way she'd have wanted, sudden and unbowed. Out at the corral she ran until the last week of her life. And I miss her the way you'd miss your own right hand. And I talk to her still, out here in the evenings, and I don't much care if that makes me foolish. I earned a little foolishness. Penn runs the place now. She's a woman grown with children of her own, and she's got her father's laugh and her aunt's spine and the best hands with a horse this valley ever saw. Della's not accepted, though I'd never have said so to Della's face. Her oldest girl is named Della, and the little one climbs up on this porch railing and swings her legs and watches the road exactly the way her grandmother. For that's what Della was to her. In every way that mattered, watched it for 7 years. And when I see her up there, I have to look away a while. People ask me sometimes, the few who know the whole of it, whether I'd do it again. Whether I'd give up those 7 years, knowing now they'd cost me my brother's company forever, knowing they'd buy a grave and an orphan and a town full of contempt before they bought anything good. And I tell them the truth, which is the only thing I've got left to give. I'd do it again. Not because it was easy and not because it came out right, though by some grace it did. I'd do it again because of a woman who hung a crooked gate straight and stood at it 7 years furious and faithful both. And because of a little girl who took my hand in the mud and told me there was a place for me at the table. And because the worst thing that ever happened to me and the finest thing I ever did turned out, in the long arithmetic of a life, to be the same thing. And it led me home, late, but home. To the only people who ever saw the dull, tough thing I was made of, and decided they had a use for it. I came back expecting nothing. She was waiting at the gate. Everything I have because she would not move from it and because she would not let me carry alone what was never mine alone to carry. There's no finer thing I know to say about a life than that, and an old man on a porch in the evening doesn't need to say more. The road's empty tonight, but I keep watching it anyway. Old habits, hers and now mine, we earned them together.